Thanks very much, Melissa, and for everyone at Humanists Canada for having me. I've followed some of your work, and it is really great to be here. So, my name is Alastair Lichten. I'm a humanist activist, community organizer, and writer. I've previously been head of education at the UK's National Secular Society and of local groups at Humanist UK. And I currently write the Humanist Dad blog and coordinate a local humanist group in Haywards Heath, England. As an autistic parent and humanist, I am interested in how these identities and experiences intersect. So my talk today is going to have five parts. In the beginning, I'm going to talk about the evidence that autistic people are more likely to be non-religious. In part two, I'm going to discuss what some of the factors that might explain this, and then I'm going to talk about how does the autistic humanist experience, how do those two identities and experiences intersect and to create kind of a unique perspective. And part four, I'll talk about what are the implications for movement humanism. And then hopefully we have a good amount of time for questions and discussions. I'll start with some quick definitions. So neurodiversity is the diverse different ways in which ways that our brains work. So we all have neurodiversity. We're all along a neurodiversity spectrum. But neurotypical is the types of neurodiversity or the range of neurodiversity that we consider typical, and we sometimes use terms like normal, kind of some normative, maybe potentially judgmental terms about neurotypical and around neurodivergent. So neurodivergents are the types of neurodiversities that we consider atypical or unusual. And some ways of being neurodivergent cluster or clump together and have name. So people tend to have multiple of these at once, or more likely to, or their experiences have quite a lot in common. So we call one of these clusters has names like autism, ADHD, dyspraxia, dyslexia, dyscalculia, and autism is within that a form of neurodivergence that is associated with difficulties with social interaction and repetitive thoughts or behaviors. And autism is a subset of neurodivergence, I guess, in a similar way that humanism is a subset of non-religion. I was recently on a podcast called Embrace the Void discussing autism and movement atheism. And afterwards, I realized there were two very important points that I didn't make explicitly. So I just want to say them kind of now at the beginning of our talk. And you can just go ahead and assume that that is subtext for most of what else I'm going to say. Uh, One, Christo-fascists want autistic people not to exist. And two, I realized I didn't check if I was allowed to swear before starting the meeting. Slide. So, part one, evidence of correlation. My contention is that autism does correlate with non-religion, i.e., that autistic people are more likely to be non-religious. However, I will freely admit that my experiences or my anecdotal evidence, what we might say, from involvement in humanist, skeptical, atheist activism in the UK, in communities online and in person. Though that's anecdotal evidence, is what convinces me of that, and finding the empirical evidence or lack thereof for this anecdotal correlation may be a little bit tricky. However, with or without a correlation, the ways in which humanists and atheist experience intersect are still worthy of interest and analysis and are still very important at this point in time. So, evidence. Investigating whether autistic people are indeed empirically more likely to be non-religious has difficulties. Uh, Both autism and non-religion manifest differently in different cultures. The number of gods you believe in is one or it is zero or more than zero. That kind of doesn't change. But what it means to be non-religious, an atheist, a humanist is very different in different cultures, as is what it means to be neurodivergent. Whereas the research and my ability to assess it is limited to the Anglosphere. And I, as you saw in the introduction, I'm an activist, a writer, etc. I'm not necessarily a trained social scientist. Both autism and non-religion are under-researched, and where they are studied, they are often viewed through a deficit lens or in contrast to supposed um, either allistic, which is non-autistic, or religious norms. So, but in summary, I would say 3 points. One, research is limited and empirical evidence does not yet match anecdotes. But two, all the studies that I could find suggested at least some correlation. And despite my best efforts, I could find no studies which either addressed and disputed this correlation or suggested an inverse correlation. So I could not find any studies suggesting that um, autistic people are more likely to be religious. However, there are some studies that say that when autistic people are religious, they tend to have more individualistic interpretations of their religious traditions. So, example studies. There, some of the key papers that I found in my research are the 2011 paper on religious belief systems of persons with high functioning autism. Uh, should point out often some of the language in research around autistic people is not where we in the activist sphere might want to see it. There's a 2012 paper on mentalizing deficits constrain belief in a personal God that very much focuses on the theory of mind model, which I'll come on to talk later. And a 2024 meta study on the intersection of religiosity and neurodiversity in autistic adolescents that suggests that the studies it looks at show a correlation, but that because investigating that correlation wasn't the main focus of the examined studies, that the evidence. So it's the meta study said there is a correlation, but the evidence for that correlation is somewhat weak. Uh, the After I'd done a lot of this research, I started reading a book called The Autistic Atheist by Emily Cooper, and that's a 2024 book, and that does have a really quite comprehensive literature review of what is out there. So we can, if anyone wants to dispute it, we can come back to it in the Q&A. But I think just for the sake of expanding the conversation, sending that conversation in more useful directions, we can just kind of assume there is this correlation. But again, even if there's not, even the correlation doesn't exist, there is still an important intersection between humanism or atheism and autism, and those experiences have kind of they are still important to consider. I believe that the explanation for any correlation will likely be found in some combination of four factors. But as we get to these factors, particularly 3 and 4 on my list, you'll see that some of these can maybe be broken down further or can be divided in slightly different ways. So most things would fit in with these factors, but there may be some crossover, etc. So the four factors I'm going to talk about are one, neuroqueerness, two, theory of mind, and within theory of mind, I'll be talking about the theory of mind model itself, as well as the empathizing versus systematizing thinking models, and I will stumble over pronouncing most of those as well. The third area I'll talk about, the third potential factor is secular cognition, including, and I would include under that some crossover with the theory of mind model, but I'd also include under that autistic and atheistic relationships to cognitive dissonance and different theistic versus atheistic, autistic versus neurotypical models of thinking about morality. And the fourth factor I'm going to look at is social taboos and norms, particularly around religion and autistic resistance to peer pressure. So, neuroqueerness. Academically and empirically, this is the most straightforward factor, ironically. But it is also one of the most consequential when we consider the intersection of humanist and autistic identities and the implications for our movement. So when I say it's this is the least controversial, I mean in terms of evidence, maybe not socially controversial or not. It is basically a fact that neurodivergent and autistic people in particular are more likely to be LGBTQ. An article in Psychology Today in June of this year says that 30 to 70% of neurodivergent people identify as LGBTQ. In the UK, the Trevor Project says that autistic people are 6 times more likely to be trans. So the only academic debate remaining here really is whether are autistic people more likely to be LGBTQ, or are autistic people more likely to be honest about being LGBTQ? And that might tie into some of the social norms and taboo stuff we talk about later. And again, I think we can take it as read, certainly within the context of Western religious and post-religious societies such as Canada and the UK, that LGBTQ people are more likely to be non-religious. And again, is that because they are more likely to be non-religious, or are there social factors driving them away from organized religion? That could remain to be seen. Queer theorists and psychologists Nick Walker and Athena Leon Michaels Dillion, I apologize if I pronounced that incorrectly. They both separately invented the term neuroqueerness to describe the intersection between neurodivergent and queer experiences. More controversially, the term is used by some straight cis autistic people to describe a sense of queerness that is rooted in their or connection to queer culture that is rooted in their experiences of neurodivergence rather than in their sexuality or gender identity. And that raises questions of appropriation versus gatekeeping that probably kind of beyond my scope as such a cis autistic person to make any sort of ruling on. The big one in external explanations is theory of mind. So the go-to or pop science or sometimes reductive explanation of autism is that autistic people lack theory of mind or have an underdeveloped theory of mind. And anytime a neurodivergent person acts differently to a neurotypical person or an allistic person, you can just blame it on poor theory of mind. So, for example, the two papers that I mentioned previously, the 2012 paper on mentalizing deficits, constraining belief in a personal God, that basically just argues that autistic people are more likely to be non-religious because they lack a theory of mind. They're not correctly imagining this external mind of God, I guess you would say. The 2011 paper, Religious Belief Systems of Persons with High Functioning Autism. We will come back to that term later. Also, that's very much based on theory of mind model. Professor Sir Simon Baron-Cohen is an expert in autism and is credited with popularizing the theory of mind and the empathizing versus systematizing thinking models. So these argue that that autistic people struggle socially because they have poor theory of mind, which is the ability to understand and attribute different mental states to ourselves or others. You may argue that partly this is developed because of an overemphasis on adolescent autistic people and this idea that autism was something you kind of grow out of, but that's a bit of a wider critique. And so he argues that autistic people struggle socially because of this, and because of an over-reliance on, like I say, very slowly so I don't get stuck, systematizing thinking, that is understanding the world through laws and systems, rather than empathizing thinking, understanding the world through the thoughts and feelings of others. And all of us switch back and forth between these two models of thinking in our day-to-day lives, but autistic people they tend to maybe get stuck on to some level or over rely or have one to describe it on the systematizing thinking. In the same way, many humanists are driven to understand the natural world, and favor naturalistic over supernatural or agency-driven explanations. In the 2022 Blackham lecture, that's a Humanist UK lecture, Sir Baron Cohen argued that because we can identify patterns, specifically what he calls if and then patterns, that the genes that give humans their unique ability of pattern recognition overlap with the genes for autism and have played a key role in human progress. If we were to shift away briefly from autism to look at other forms of neurodiversity, there is evidence, perhaps surprising given our often deficit based framing of these, that other forms of neurodivergence, such as dyspraxia, dyslexia, and even dyscalculia, are that people with those conditions display better than neurotypical pattern recognition skills. I don't know if that means that being bad at maths makes you more likely to be an atheist, but I'm sure there's a joke in there somewhere about the Trinity. But systematizing thinking could be why we see neurodiverse people didn't say we see humanists are overrepresented in scientific fields. Secular cognition. Uh, so I believe Phil Zuckerman, possibly I might be getting this wrong, but is well-known professor of sociology and secular studies. I think he coined the term secular cognition, which annoyingly is also used in an entirely different sense to refer to something entirely different as well. Thank you, sociology. But I think he coined the term with his co-authors on a paper, the name of which is just escaping my memory at the moment. But secular cognition refers to the cognitive processes and traits associated with non-religious individuals. So people who are non-religious don't tend to just agree on the number of gods there are. They tend to think about certain problems, certain issues in similar ways to other non-religious people in ways which are markedly different to the average religious person. And obviously, this talk about averages, individuals vary widely. So secular cognition can be things like a preference for analytical and rational thinking. We complement ourselves quite a lot there, don't we? Openness to new experiences and intellectualism. And secular cognition may mean that there are ways of thinking correlated with autism which lead to non-religious thinking, i.e., does thinking autistically lead one to thinking atheistically? I think it does, but I don't think this has been particularly well researched. We touched on this under the theory of mind module, but I'll briefly consider an example of how empathizing versus systematizing thinking can sort of map to theistic versus atheistic thinking. So, under the theistic model, look at those trees. Who made them? Under the atheistic model, look at those trees. What made them? Creationism versus evolution. Theistic thinking, who threw that lightning bolt? Uh, Atheistic thinking, what caused that lightning bolt? Was it Thor or was it electrostatic forces in the atmosphere? And you can see how those forms of theistic thinking kind of map pretty well to empathizing thinking. We're talking about who explanations, and the atheistic ways of thinking map to the systematizing ways of thinking. We'll talk about what what and systems and naturalistic processes. So humanists will be familiar with the phrases good without God or belief in good. And the idea that morality requires a powerful outside observer is very theistic. I would also argue it is quite authoritarian, and you can potentially see that map to uh, religious versus non-religious thinking about policing and enforcement of social norms in society. That might be going a little bit stretching a little bit far, but that's what I would say anyway. But it is notable how both autistic and atheistic thinking about morality tends to focus less on the observer role. Kind of a brief aside here. One thing that's interesting about autistics talking about kind of Christian concepts of God is that exposure anxiety and scopophobia, the phobia of being watched or stared at, are very common among autistic people. And that could lead to us being less enamored with the idea of an all-seeing God. I've heard many autistic people who particularly who've come out of religious backgrounds or in generally critical of that kind of idea of an all-seeing, all-knowing God, describe that as being something just inherently and deeply uncomfortable. Uh, one case study I'm going to selectively summarize here, just because it's to keep it kind of focused on what we're talking about, is a 2021 paper in the Journal of Neuroscience, and I've written this down because I'm going to pronounce it wrong again, aren't I? But it's right temporal or racial junction underlines avoidance of moral transgression in autism spectrum disorder. So there was an fMRI element to this study. fMRI might be bullshit, I hear. I'm not entirely sure one way or the other, so I'm not going to comment too much on that. But basically, stick people in an fMRI machine and watch how their brains work differently when they're making certain decisions. But simplifying things, focusing on what we want to talk about, is this was a two-stage experiment that set up two groups of autistic and what it describes as neurotypical. I'm not sure if it's just autistic and allistic, i.e., non-autistic participants. But in both stages, participants could give money to a good cause at a personal cost to them, or they could give money to a bad cause to a bad cause, but they would get like a financial reward back. And the paper describes these as the more as quite this is the morally correct choice, and this is the morally selfish choice. I think if I kind of understand it correctly, it involved some fake charities, and one charity kind of helped street cats, and one charity euthanized street cats. It might be that the problem with this paper is that autistic people may just like cats more than neurotypical people. But anyway, so in both stages, participants could give money to the good cause, it costs them money. They could give money to the bad cause, they get some money back for themselves. And the stages were labeled the public condition and so they were labeled the private condition, loving the cat emojis. So they're labeled the private condition and the public condition. And in the private condition, you made the choice and no one else knows. And in the public condition, you knew that the other participants in the study would either would or potentially could know the decision you're making. And basically, the experiment found that unlike the neurotypical participants, autistic participants showed no difference in their moral decisions between the public and private conditions, i.e., when they were unobserved, neurotypical participants were much more likely to make the selfish choice. And when they were observed, neurotypical participants were much more likely to make the moral choice. Whereas the autistic participants, they just made the same choices whether or not they were observed. The researchers, they put this down to poor theory of mind. I can see quite a strong analogy there for theistic versus atheistic morality. Cognitive dissonance. So, auti um, autistic people and atheists can be irrational. They can have blind spots. They can think they are far more rational than they are, and all of us can have cognitive dissonance. Do not believe anyone who puts forward this idea of either autistic people or atheists as Spock-like Vulcans. But crucially, when aware of them, autistic people find the experience of cognitive dissonance much more uncomfortable and potentially debilitatingly so compared to our neurotypical peers. Maintaining religious belief in the face of doubts and skepticism leads to cognitive dissonance. I feel I'm kind of safe saying this to a humanist audience. It's because religion is not actually true in many of its claims. So that doubt and skepticism leads to cognitive dissonance, discomfort with which may lead autistic people to resolve that cognitive dissonance by abandoning religious beliefs, and may lead neurotypical people to resolve cognitive dissonance by ignoring it. Sensitivity to cognitive dissonance may also increase autistic people's awareness and sensitivity to contradictions and inconsistencies within religious narratives. Autistics and atheists are often being accused of being closed-minded or lacking in imagination in similar ways, which boil down, which strongly relate to moralizing views around how we respond to cognitive dissonance and cognitive dissonance intolerance. So this kind of blew up in 2017 when there was a Science Direct paper that was written by a Catholic university, and it was really I'm not sure it was definitely in much American and British press, mainstream press, and religious interest specific press as well, because this study purported to show that atheists are more closed-minded than religious believers. And the way in which that played into stereotypes reminded me, when I was kind of going back and thinking of this, reminded very strongly how certain other accusations of intolerance or closed-mindedness about autistic people play into negative stereotypes about us. The actual study, interestingly enough, if you ignore the press release and the spin, it actually showed that atheist participants were less dogmatic than religionists by in part one of the study by kind of all the traditional measures. Would you be happy being friends with? Do you consider yourself intolerant, etc. So it actually showed that atheistic people were less intolerant than their co-religion than religionists. In part two of the study, atheist supporters of same-sex couples' adoption rights rated their opponents' arguments as less convincing than religious opponents of same-sex couple adoption rights rated arguments against their position. And the paper said that this was closed-minded my-sidism bias. It could also be that the arguments were better on one side or the other. Um, and then finally, the paper, the experiment as they gave participants 6 statements, and it doesn't matter if the statements were actually true or not. They were written in such way that basically only three of them could possibly be true. So if one statement was true, if they were in pairs, so if one statement was true, the other statement in the pair couldn't be true. And they asked people, how many statements do you think could be true out of these 6? And religionists were much more likely to say that, well, I think all 6 statements might be true, and religious people and atheists were more likely to say, oh no, around 3 could be true. And the paper attributed this to an intolerance of contradiction and an inability to imagine the other person's position again. But going a little bit off track here, but in a similar way, autistic people can be very sensitive to and direct about logical contradictions, but that doesn't necessarily mean they are closed-minded. I know a lot of autistic people. I do know a lot of a lot of closed-minded people as well. Um, Social taboos and norms. Autistic people often struggle understanding social constructs, taboos, and implicit norms. In fact, it's part of the diagnostic criteria of autism is how you process and how people relate to those. Autistic people are also often willing to violate cultural taboos, not always because we don't understand them, but also because we aren't persuaded by them. Again, the idea that autistic people are immune to peer pressure is just not accurate, but we tend to deal with peer pressure and relate to peer pressure in different ways. It might make autistic people more willing to break cultural norms and taboos. And if you know if you've ever seen any cliche written autistic character on any film or television, you're going to know what I mean there. Um, so autistic people may be willing to violate cultural taboos around identifying as non-religious or criticizing religious norms. And even in more secular societies such as the UK or Canada, where being passively non-religious is pretty mainstream, being actively irreligious or humanist, it is still something of a taboo. I remember at school I got into trouble a lot for getting overexcited and not being able to hide when I found things funny or absurd. And this could be a particular problem in religious education where that was often treated as or read as disrespect. And I've since spoken to many autistic people who got into trouble at school uh, or in supplemental education like Sunday schools for asking questions about religion. Perhaps they had not learnt unspoken rules around respecting religion. And yeah, we autistic people, we sometimes don't necessarily respect rules of politeness because we think that might think that other things are more important. Um, so how does this lead to kind of intersections between humanism and atheism? Uh, i.e., how do autistic humanist experiences interact and intersect? Some of the ways in which kind of that might happen, we've kind of we've covered by necessity in talking about these potential explanations, but there are a couple of others that I want to talk about briefly. Emerging identity, justice sensitivity, Christofascism, and ritual creation. So, emerging identity. People don't really convert to humanism by and large. What happens more often is that people come to understand the humanist label and that it applies to them. It could be they've always been humanists but not had a word or identity to describe this, or it could be that they're looking for a label to describe themselves after a significant change of belief. But the humanist label is normally retrospective. It's descriptive. Like many late diagnosed autistic adults, my coming to understand myself as autistic was during a significant life crisis. So I think I was getting treated for PTSD, and I began to explore an autism diagnosis with my therapist. However, this has been something I'd thought about for many years. I have recently learned that most neurotypical people do not spend like a decade plus wondering if they're autistic. Um, there were no signs. But as I began to understand myself as autistic and I stopped masking, I felt I had to learn how to function in a very basic sense when all my coping mechanisms and self-beliefs needed to be re-examined. And the experience of apostates and deconstructionists really spoke to me in this period. I can't remember I remember reading or listening to someone talking about this kind of sudden sense of existential dread of kind of feeling like if I stop believing in God, then I need to stop. Then what do I believe in? Does gravity exist? Am I going to fall off the world, off into the sky? Uh, as I became more confident in using the autistic label, I found it becoming more affirming and more important in my identity. And this mirrored my changing relationship to the label humanist and how that became over time more central within my more nebulous non-religious identity. Justice sensitivity. So, there's a quote here from Attitude Magazine about justice sensitivity. Um, Whether it's triggered by social injustice or small inequities, justice sensitivity causes us to perceive unfairness and wrongdoing in the world more frequently and to feel it more acutely than neurotypical peers. Neurodivergent people can have extreme justice sensitivity and a powerful sense of justice. I should be very clear that justice sensitivity does that strong does not necessarily mean accurate. All of us can miss our targets. So a little bit of background noise there. Uh, Similarly, humanism has a very long tradition of social justice, and humanists are often inspired by their values to support various human rights causes. And lots of neurodivergent people have social justice problems, which kind of force them to leave religion. Christofascism. I mean, it probably goes without saying that most reactionary religious and political groups are not massive fans of diversity to start with. Neurodiversity can pose particular problems for certain religious groups. Firstly, neurodivergence can provide naturalistic explanations for many religious experiences. It can also be a challenge for preconceptions of there being only one rational way of thinking, which can be a threat to some apologetics, particularly presuppositional apologetics. All apologetics is presuppositional, but that which calls itself. And some stuff about kind of human minds being made in God's image. Neurodiversity is a little bit of a threat to that. But when it comes to Christo-fascism in Europe and speaking to Canadian humanists among your neighbours to the south, autistic people are particularly threatened. And of course, fascists of all types have often viewed autistic and neurodivergent people as economically non-productive, potential targets, and therefore potential targets for. Thanks. Sorry about that. As I say, the very language used to describe, often used to describe autism, such as high/low functioning and Asperger's syndrome, that has its roots in the Holocaust. And we see that legacy in the eugenicist narratives around autism and vaccines and around various pseudoscientific cures for autism. As neuroqueerness and the correlation between autism and LGBTQ identities has become better understood, the targeting of autistic people by various far-right movements has also increased. Basically, I would say if humanists are ever in doubt of who their ally should be, they should start by looking at who their enemies are targeting. Uh, ritual creation is another interesting implication. So, humanists and autistic people both have complicated relationships, one might say, with ritual and tradition, especially where these are externally imposed. Particularly in the religious context, we tend to see all the ways in which it can be twisted or coercive. And on the other hand, both humanists and autistic people often find a lot of value in rituals and practices that they create themselves, from stimming to ceremonies. Rituals should be our tools, not our masters. And the best way, I believe, to take ownership of rituals is to create and adapt our own. Humanists and autistic people often have problems because with traditions because or rituals because the rules around them are implicit, they feel arbitrary, and they often are attributed to unclear or mystical sources. But when we acknowledge that rules around any tradition are made up, they become much more explicit and much more personalizable. There's a reason that humanist wedding ceremonies and humanist funerals are just much more personalizable than religious counterparts. Implications. What then are the implications for movement humanism and humanist communities? It would be good to explore these further in the Q&A, particularly as I think I'm running about 5 minutes over time. But I'd like to put forward some suggestions. Recognition. There's the implications for the humanist movement. Recognition. Humanists must recognize and celebrate the presence and contributions of autistic people in our movement. Remembering also autistic people's difficulties with subtext and implicit messaging about the humanist movement's recognition of autistic people must be very explicit. Uh, Solidarity. The humanist movement must offer autistic people unequivocal solidarity in their struggles against their targeting by the reactionary right. Given neuroqueerness and intersections between anti-autistic and anti-queer bigotry, this must mean the autistic movement restoring its stellar reputation for solidarity with queer communities that has been tarnished by high-profile issues with transphobia. Accommodation. I'm happy to skip over some of my talking points about some of the practical ways that humanist communities can be more accommodating, and I'm happy to maybe revisit that in the talks because I do feel I'm a couple of minutes behind time here. Uh, Harnessing neurodiversity. I don't want to get into the whole autism is a superpower narrative and the problems around that. But there are ways in which the contributions of autistic people to enrich humanist communities can be better harnessed. I think particularly around special interests. Humanist groups often have trouble finding external speakers while overlooking potential contributions from your existing community. autistic people have special interests, I are happy to talk about and with the right support. And humanist groups should be places where people can, all of us, autistic or not, can kind of find joy in special interests and what I would call humanist and autistic joy. Uh, Barriers. We've got to remove barriers to autistic people's participation in humanist communities, and that includes exclusionary language, such as calling religious people crazy or mentally ill. That also includes in our science. Bear in mind that our science advocacy and challenging of pseudoscience and alternative medicine is not putting off autistic people in our narratives around that. We need to remember that it's important to is the humanist, the secular, and skeptic movements play really important roles here. We've got to remember also that many autistic people have been mistreated by mainstream medicine, and that can drive them towards certain alternatives and forms of pseudoscience, as well as being victims of it. And expectations. One of the biggest barriers for neurodivergent people participating in any sort of community can be worries over unclear expectations and implicit rules. This can be a particular problem with humanist communities because there are few mainstream representations or really models of what's expected. If people think People might be thinking, oh, what's a humanist community? Do you just sit around and talk about how clever you are for realizing God doesn't exist? Be explicit in what you in what your community is there for, and that will make it easier, I think, for certain groups. So I'm happy at this point to I think now I've caught up with time, so I'm happy just to open it up to questions. If anyone's got anything that they want to share, and my answers might be I don't know for some of them, but we'll see.
Thank you so much. You can also you can either unmute your mic or write your question in the chat. I will be turning off the mic as the recording as well. Ahmed, please. Yes, go ahead.